the genius of generosity. Church, we live in a universe, we live in a world that is governed by laws. There are certain laws by which we all must abide. Now, I am not talking about laws that a government or a legislature might pass. That's not the kind of law I'm talking about. Those laws change over time. What was legal in the past is not necessarily legal today, and vice versa. They change over time. Laws passed by a government or a legislature vary by place. For example, the laws we live by here in the United States are not the same as laws people live by in other parts of the world. And laws that are passed by a government or legislature aren't always enforced the same way for all people. We see injustices in our world. No, the laws I'm talking about, these universal laws, are laws that are true for everybody, everywhere, for all time, in exactly the same way. Okay? These universal laws I'm speaking about are true for everybody, everywhere, for all time, in exactly the same way. So let me give you an example. One of the universal laws by which we live is the law of gravity. Gravity. Okay. It doesn't matter where you are, who you are, or when you are. Things have been falling throughout history all over the world. Did you know that? And they fall exactly the same way. They fall down. The law of gravity is true for everybody, everywhere, for all time, and it affects everybody in exactly the same way. Now, let me make a couple of observations about these universal laws by which we live. Number one, they are independent of what you believe. Okay? If somebody comes and says, I do not believe in the law of gravity. Okay, I suppose that's okay, but the law of gravity is going to impact that person exactly the same way it impacts believers in gravity. Doesn't matter if you're an unbeliever or a believer, gravity is true for you. It's independent of belief. Here's the second observation of these universal laws. When we choose to violate them, things do not go well. Let's say someone decided they were going to try to violate the law of gravity. They were going to defy the law of gravity. They go to the top of a tall building, say, I am going to defy the law of gravity when I jump off this building. They can do that believing that gravity does not exist, but it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt. Pain, we experience pain in life many times because we violate the universal laws by which we all live. This morning, I want to share with you one of these universal laws. And it's the law of sowing and reaping. The law of sowing and reaping. Because the law of sowing and reaping really does help us to understand the genius of generosity. It is genius to be generous in large part because of this universal law called the law of sowing and reaping. If you have your Bibles, turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, that's where our sermon text is going to come from this morning. Let me tee it up for you. Here's what's happening. The Apostle Paul is writing this letter to the Corinthian church, the Corinthian believers. And he's writing this letter to them in anticipation of, in advance of his visit there. In fact, in the letter he says, look, I'm coming to you, so I want you to be ready for me when I get there. And one of the reasons Paul wants them to be ready is because when he shows up, he is going to receive an offering. That's one of the reasons we know Paul was a Baptist. Paul was going there, just kidding. One of the reasons Paul was going there to receive an offering. In fact, Paul had been traveling all over, receiving money from churches so that he could take that money back to the mother church in Jerusalem to support and undergird that church. So Paul writes to the Corinthian church and he says, look, I'm coming and I want you to be ready to give an offering, a generous offering when I get there. And in the letter, he says this. He says, I've been traveling in Macedonia, and man, these Macedonian believers are really generous. You ought to be generous like they're generous. In fact, here's what he says, chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy, speaking of the Macedonian believers, their overflowing joy in their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. So Paul tells the Corinthian church, look, I hope you're as generous as these Macedonian believers have been. Then he says something, it's almost humorous. I giggle when I read this. Paul says, look, I want you Corinthian believers to understand something. I've been talking you up. I've been bragging on you. Everywhere I've gone, I've told them how generous and how wonderful the Corinthian believers are. And in the first part of chapter 9, Paul says, look, if some of these Macedonian believers come with me to Corinth, and when I receive this offering, you're not generous, you're going to embarrass me. Do not make me eat my words. Be generous as they have been generous. Okay, that tees up this morning's sermon text found in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning with verse 6. Let's stand together as we honor the reading of God's word. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, starting at verse 6. Paul tells the Corinthian church, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. As it is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor, their righteousness endures forever. Verse 10. Now he who supplies the seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way so that your generosity So that you can be generous on every occasion, and through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. You may be seated. All right. The main idea for this morning is really quite simple. Here is the main idea for today's sermon. Generous people reap generously. It's the genius of generosity. Generous people reap generously. Whoever sows generously will reap generously. Okay, here's what I want to do right here. I just want to take a little bit of a time out, a pause, to make a very important clarification, because there's an elephant in the room. I'm very much aware that there are many in our culture who twist this law of sowing and reaping into something that it is not. Sometimes we refer to it as the prosperity gospel or prosperity theology. Here's the way that goes. If you want to get more, if that's what you want, if you want to get more, all you got to do is give, and you'll get. Okay? That is a twist on this law of sowing and reaping. Why is it a twist? Because at the heart of that theology is the fact that it centers on and caters to a selfish heart. If you want to get, if that's your objective, if you want to get, then the way to get is to give. Okay, that is not what the law of sowing and reaping says. In fact, there's a very important verse that clarifies this. Verse 11, let me reread it to you. Paul says, you will be enriched in every way, so that you can keep and enjoy everything you get. No. You will be enriched in every way. Why? So that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will ultimately result in thanksgiving to God. You see, the law of sowing and reaping is not the means by which you get more. The law of sowing and reaping is the means by which you're able to give more. Now, in light of that very important point of clarification, let me share with you how this law of sowing and reaping works. Number one, and this is familiar to many of you. Number one, you will reap what you sow. It is a universal truth. You will reap, and I will reap what we sow. In other words, we should not expect to get back differently than we give out. Okay, if you want watermelons, and you sow watermelon seed, and then you change your mind and, for whatever reason, say, I want zucchini. Why you change what? Okay, but I changed my mind. Now I really want, so I'm really hoping those watermelon seeds come up zucchini. That's never going to happen. You know that. Why? Because of the law of sowing and reaping. You're going to get whatever you sow. Now, Jesus actually gave us examples of what this looks like. Many examples. Let me share with you just a few. In Luke chapter 6, watch what Jesus says. Law of sowing and reaping. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. In other words, if you sow non-judgmentalism, you will reap non-judgmentalism. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. See, what you give out comes back. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap, for with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Okay, the reason I wanted to read that is because Jesus points out two very important things about this idea that we will reap what we sow. He speaks to content and quantity. He says, this law of sowing and reaping, you will get what you sow in terms of content. So if you want to receive friends into your life, sow friendliness. If you want to receive grace from others, sow grace. If you want to receive mercy from others, sow mercy. So that's good news, because that means you and I can actually determine the content of our inflow. You and I actually, law of sowing and reaping, we actually have the ability to determine the content of what comes to us. But Jesus also speaks to quantity. All right. He says, for with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Let's go back to our watermelons. If I want 50 watermelon vines, I can't just sow one seed. If I sow one seed, I'm going to get one watermelon vine. If I want 50 watermelon vines, I have to sow 50 seed. And that's what Jesus is saying here. With the measure you sow out, that will determine the quantity of your inflow. So we can actually determine the content and quantity of our inflow by how we sow. All right, number two, here's another way this works. This is obvious. Sowing precedes reaping. All right, what do I mean by that? To gather, you first have to scatter. A farmer never goes out to a garden where nothing has been planted and say to himself, I wonder where all my stuff is. I mean, why is nothing coming up? No. Why? Because you have to sow before you reap. Now, what makes sense, perfect sense, in a garden is sometimes really, really tough in life. And let me tell you why. Here's why it's so hard to sow first before we reap. Seeds become precious to us. And if I throw my seeds out, if I sow them, I no longer have them. And they are too precious to me to let go of and sow in hopes that something is going to result. The classic example of this is, you've all heard this. Remember the man staggering through the desert? Been staggering for a long time, dying of thirst, almost out of energy. And he walks up over this little dune, sand dune, and in the distance he sees a small shack. Okay. With his last bit of energy, this stranded man makes his way to that shack and opens the door. When he opens the door, he sees 3 items. The first thing that he notices is this water pump right there in the middle of this shack, a big water pump. The second thing he sees is a jar of crystal clear water with the lid on top. The third item that he sees is a note. And the note reads something like this: to prime this water pump so that it can give you all the water you could possibly need, you have to empty the entire contents of the water jar into the pump. Once you do that, the water pump will give you as much water as you need. When you finish and you've had your fill the water jar back up, put the lid back on it, and leave it for the next traveler. All right. That man has a decision to make, doesn't he? Does he drink the sure thing? Does he hold on to what he knows he has? Or does he trust the testimony about the water pump enough to sow his seeds there in hopes of getting an abundant return? Now, you and I prayerfully will never be staggering through the desert and be faced with a decision like that. But we make that same decision all the time. And you know what I find to be tragic? It's tragic when Christians drink the jar of water. God's saying, if you will just sow your seeds, I can do so much more with your seeds than you can. You see, sowing before you reap really is a matter of trust. The man has to make the decision: do I trust the testimony about this water pump enough to pour my most precious thing, the life-saving water, in this jar? And you and I have to answer that same question. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 10. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also, not might, not sometimes, not most of the time, will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. Okay, let me just ask you a question. How much do you believe that? Because sowing before we reap really does come down to a matter of trust. Do you trust the testimony about what God has said he will do? All right, thirdly and finally, God blesses godly sowing. Verse 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. Christian, listen. When we sow for God's benefit, God blesses us abundantly so that we can sow more for God's benefit. In other words, God operates here exactly the same way we do. All right, let me explain. Let's just suppose that you come into a large amount of money, okay? A large amount of money. And you need someone to invest that money for you to make more, to earn an interest, earn a dividend. So you don't know any financial planners. So here's what you do. You go to Google and you just type financial planners in my area, and you just look at the list of names, and you look at their Yelp ratings or Google ratings or whatever ratings they have, and you pick one. You don't know them. You don't know anybody who knows them. You just pick one. All right. When you first invest with that person, you're probably not going to give him all of your money. No, probably what you're going to do is you're going to give him or her a little bit of your money and see what they do with that money. Now, if your financial planner, your new financial planner, takes that little bit of money you give them and they generate more, you're likely to give them more money to manage on your behalf. And if they continue to generate a profit, you might give them more and more and more. However, if you give that financial planner a little bit of your money, and that financial planner takes that money and uses it on himself, takes his family on a big vacation somewhere or something, chances are you're not going to trust that same financial planner again. You're certainly not going to give him more of your money if he was unfaithful with the little bit. Now, the reason that's such a great example is because it's exactly the one Jesus used. Listen to this, Luke 16, verse 10. Jesus says this, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much." So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, if you've not been trustworthy handling money, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? You see, God blesses those who are generous for His benefit because He knows He can trust them. So here comes the question of the morning. This is the question I want to leave you with. How much can God trust you with? How much can God trust you with? In other words, how much is so much that God can no longer trust us to be faithful to use what He has entrusted to us for His benefit, not ours? Christian, one of the most beautiful truths that we can learn and live by is this one. God always resources His causes. Now, God is not obligated to resource your causes or my causes, but God always resources His pet projects. Here's what that means. When your generosity becomes about enabling and empower and mobilizing God's purposes, God is going to richly bless that kind of generosity because He always resources His projects. The law of sowing and reaping is a law by which we all live. It's independent of our belief. And when we violate that law, things do not go well. What does your harvest look like? Are you reaping generously for God's glory because you're sowing generously for God's glory? Generous people reap generously. Let me close with an invitation. And I want to ask a question to all those who are listening, both here in the room and online. Here's the question. How would you describe your relationship with your Creator? How would you describe your relationship with your Creator? In other words, are you trying to live life with God in the background? You know, God is out there somewhere. He's far off. It really has nothing to do with my life. Or is God very much part of your life? Now, the reason that's such an important question is that God never intended for any person to live life disconnected from Him. In fact, I say this often. If you're trying to live life disconnected from God, the one who created you, you're trying to do something God never intended you to try. He never intended anybody to try that. Because the energy and the power to overcome the world and to live this sometimes painful, disappointing, discouraging life is only found in Him. So here's what God did. God realized that we needed Him desperately for life. And he also realized that he could have nothing to do with us because of our sin. God's perfect and holy. He can't welcome someone into his family who's not perfect and holy. So here's what God did to fix our problem. He sent Jesus Christ, his son, to this world to die in your place and in mine. And those who place their faith in Jesus' payment for sin will have their sins washed away. We can be whiter than snow so that we can have a relationship with our perfect and holy Creator and live life the way life was designed to be lived. Can I ask you a question? Have you placed your faith in what Jesus did for you? Jesus came all the way from the paradise of heaven to suffer an agonizing death on a Roman cross and gave his life so you could be forgiven and wiped clean. I'd like to lead you in a prayer. If you feel God knocking at your heart's door this morning, that may be God inviting you to accept him into your life. God says, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone opens the door, I will come in and I will abide with him. Is God knocking at your heart's door? If so, I would invite you to pray along with me in your heart. But heads are bowed, eyes are closed. Your heartfelt prayer to the Creator might sound something like this one. Dear God, I recognize I need forgiveness. I believe Jesus, your Son, died in my place and 3 days later rose from the dead. And I'm placing all my trust in what Jesus did for me for forgiveness of my sin so that I can be whiter than snow. Accept me into your family as I accept Jesus, your Son, into my life. In his name I pray. Amen. Everyone looking this way, one of the things we do here at Redeemer every single week is offer those who pray that life-changing, eternity-altering prayer. We offer you literature that helps you understand more fully what it means to place your faith in Jesus. That literature is waiting for you back at guest services as you leave. It's over on the left-hand side of our grand foyer as you leave. Please go by and receive it from us. Those of you watching online, we would love to be able to offer you the same literature. We'll mail it to you if you'll send us your mailing address. You can do so by clicking the decision response form link just above the video that you're watching on our website. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll find that link in the comments section. And if you're watching on our mobile app, you'll find it on the home page. But if you'll fill out that decision response form, send it to us, we will put your literature in the mail to you this week.